President Xi is going to use Seattle in order to highlight the economic side of the relationship, especially the upside in terms of opportunities for business and cooperation, and also to reach out on kind of people-to-people basis. I think he'll visit a high school and that kind of thing, put more of a human face on this relationship.
In the state visit in Washington, D.C., there are obviously serious issues between the two countries. Those will likely be discussed. What are your thoughts on what might get addressed?
Well, I think the key issues will be partly cybersecurity, and that has a bunch of components to it, be the bilateral investment treaty and various other trade-related issues. It will be climate change, which is a relatively bright spot in our relationship and leading into the Paris meeting in December, which will be very important for global purposes. And I think won't be much said publicly, but also maritime issues, especially in the South China Sea, and we'll see some more positive things on military-to-military relations and that kind of thing. I think the above issues I mentioned are really the ones that will dominate the private conversations, at least.
Yeah, and in politics, we often think about optics very often. In New York, with the big speech at the United Nations, how does he end the trip in terms of what does the world want to know more about China?
Well, I'm not sure what he's going to cover at the UN in particular. China is so involved in so much of the world at this point. I'm not sure what he's going to be focusing on in his UN speech. I think overall, though, certainly on the U.S.-China side of it, we're going to try to project that this is a relationship that has its troubles, that have serious issues that we need to work out, but is one where we can find ways to cooperate, we can find ways to address major issues like nuclear proliferation, climate change, and so forth, and we can try to manage our differences so that they don't become disruptive of the entire relationship. Yeah. So serious, resolve, but also reassurance and a good visit.
I have spoken to many experts like yourselves, and it's been hard for me to get a good answer on this, so maybe you can help me. We have this very bipolar relationship with China, right? Because they are a competitor. That is a fact between the U.S. and China. But at the same time, China is a very big investor into the United States, and not just real estate and the traditional forms of investments. I mean putting factories down. I mean putting jobs up for Americans. This creates quite the unusual conflict between state politicians and federal politicians. How do you explain this to people?
Well, first of all, I don't think our relationship with China is bipolar. I think it's complicated. We have security interests, we have diplomatic interests, we have economic interests. The economic interests are partly on the trade side, partly on financial investments, and partly on direct investment in factories and enterprises, and that goes both ways. I think one of the big issues now for this trip will be, can we say something positive about real progress in negotiating a bilateral investment treaty? And if we can move that forward, I think that will have a significant positive impact on investment in both directions. But I think it's a little too early to tell how much will actually move on that issue during President Xi's visit.
What would you like to see announced regarding the bilateral treaty, if you could have your wish list and something that you think would be a perfect fit?
My wish list is very simple. I think that if the Chinese side can reduce very substantially the number and scope of sectors that are closed to foreign investment, that will be the biggest single thing that China can do to promote U.S.-China investment in both directions. Right now, the sectors where the U.S. is most competitive globally, which is to say high-end services almost across the board, are the most state-dominated and the most closed sectors in China. And I would hope to see that change, and if it changes, that will be very welcome on the U.S. side.
On climate change, the expectations are quite high following the previous meetings and the previous agreements. But at the same time, critics would say that we need a more aggressive timeline. We need more details, especially leading into Paris.
I think the focus here will be, you can't beat last November with this dramatic joint presidential press conference that really made headlines around the world. We aren't going to see that. But I think both sides are going to be very focused on highlighting what they've done to follow up on last November so that people see it wasn't just empty rhetoric, and also some new initiatives that they'll be taking to expand our cooperation and especially to get relatively ambitious outcomes in Paris. And that would reframe this what's called Conference of Parties, this major meeting in Paris, in a way that is very different from how both sides went into Copenhagen.